really happy that you are all joining us this evening. And I'm even happier that Bill is here with me, because during these past 20 years, I think you are about 15 years in, right, to Mindfish, and have Bill and Ryan both have been a partner for me in all of my referrals to anything that has to do with ACT and SAT, and also saved me thousands of dollars by helping my own children get those scores to the place where they could get merit. So I am forever grateful. I owe you lots of lunches, dinners, and beers for the rest of your life.
Whatever.
I love your, I really love your, I don't know if it's your mission statement, but on your website it says, Mindfish is committed to making the SAT and ACT accessible, intelligible, and beatable for all students. Our mission is to provide the best test prep experience in Colorado. And I would say there's no question you and Ryan have done that for our community. So I am very happy that you're here with us.
Thank you.
And what we have done is we have put together kind of some anticipated questions that we think you may have. So I'm going to hand this over to Bill so he can get the party started. But as you noticed, we do have a Q&A. So if you want to put your questions in as you have them, that's great. And we'll answer them either after in context or afterwards if we don't get to them, all of your questions tonight. So Bill, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Laura. I'm super happy to be here. I recognize at least a handful of names of those of you who are attending this as Mindfish family, so great to see you. Some of you I may have met on Zoom before, some of you might not have met or at least seen in person before, so great to see you here. Laura, I'm super excited that you invited me to take part in this. If you don't know Laura already, I'll just tell you from my experience doing test prep from about 20 years now. I started doing test prep tutoring right out of college. And then my business partner, Ryan Krug, who Laura mentioned, and I started up Mindfish in 2006. So I've been doing this for 20 years. Mindfish has been around for almost 15 years. And I've met a lot of educational consultants and a lot of college coaches in my day. And Laura is at the top of the list. So always happy to collaborate with you on this kind of thing. And just know that when Laura says something tonight, you all should pay attention because she knows what the heck she's talking about. I'm here to talk about testing, which is one piece of the more kind of holistic process that Laura can really quarterback for students who are going through this college process. And like Laura said, we put together some prospective questions. We put together some thoughts. I'm actually going to start with the punchline on the testing side. You know, sometimes I'll do these presentations and talk about a lot of stuff and then conclude with, so here's what this all means. But the question on everybody's mind about testing right now is this. I'm going to share my screen here. Aren't schools dropping the SAT and ACT? Aren't these tests going away? And you know, like Laura said, she's been doing this stuff for 25 years. I've been in this business for 20 years in various capacities. Right now, we are at a very unique time in this industry and in the college process in general. And yes, a lot of schools are adopting what we call test optional admissions policies. And it may seem obvious, but test optional means exactly what it sounds like it means. It means that a lot of colleges are not requiring SAT or ACT scores for admissions anymore. But the optional part of that phrase is highly important as well. It means students can opt to send them in with their applications if they decide to do so. So aren't schools dropping the SAT and ACT? If you read the news, it sounds like the tests are just gone away and we'll never hear from them again. And that is very misleading. There are a lot of schools, most schools in the country, that have adopted test optional policies for this fall, for the 2020 admissions cycle, that are admitting freshmen to start in 2021. Seniors who are applying to school right now have more choices that are test optional than ever before. However, this doesn't mean that the tests are going away. And the Mindfish people in here with whom I've already spoken have probably heard me say this in some way before. The key thing here is that test optional does not mean what we call test blind. Test blind means that schools cannot see test scores. They don't have a way to actually factor test scores in to the admissions policies at their institution. That's very different than test optional. Test optional, again, means you're not required to send the scores, but you can. And if you do send the scores, schools will look at them. And so there's a number of reasons why many students will still benefit from submitting test scores. One of these bullets on here is this: many schools still require test scores for merit-based scholarships. This is in a bit of a state of flux at the moment. Historically, many colleges do require scores for merit-based scholarships. This fall, it's different. A lot of schools have dropped that requirement for this fall. We expect a lot of them to go back to requiring test scores for merit-based scholarships next year. We'll see how that plays out, but historically, test scores are very important for qualifying for merit-based financial aid. There are some programs and some departments that require test scores. I think a good example of this is that many nursing programs require SAT and ACT scores, and probably will continue to do so. That's just one example, but even though the overall school may not require test scores for admissions, certain departments in the school might. This is also often true of honors programs and other special programs within an overall university. Beyond that, there have been some empirical studies that show that students who do submit scores have on average a 10% acceptance advantage, even at test optional schools. So you're not required to submit the scores, but if you do, it's often helpful. And I'm going to get back to a couple of these in a second, but one that I actually believe in is that college and life are in general not test optional. There are a lot of cases where students want to be competent test takers, either throughout their academic lives or their lives beyond college. Testing is a skill, and I consider it to be a life skill that people can learn to excel at, and that can be very helpful in many capacities in school or beyond school. I often tell people that when I feel like we do our best work as test prep people, yes, we help students score better on the test, but the bigger win for me, the thing that really inspires me when we do good work, is to see that students have more confidence, that they have more self-confidence, more belief in themselves, that they can excel at something that maybe they didn't think they were good at to start this process. And I'll tell you what, if you can achieve that kind of realization at this critical time before students go off to college, it can be hugely powerful. Now, obviously, I'm a test prep person. We help people prepare for the test. My company, Mindfish, also does a bunch of other things like academic tutoring, for instance. So you might think that I'm incentivized to tell people to take the test. And to a degree, I can't argue with that. That's part of my business. This is sort of a tangent, but earlier this year, I also started a nonprofit to do college prep for students who are under-resourced. And this is the first time we've been working with students this fall. And so I literally had kind of a gut check. I'm sitting there, we've got like a few $1,000, like $2,000 in our budget for this nonprofit. And so I'm sitting there thinking, is test prep like really the best way that I could help a couple kids with $2,000? And next year, it might be different. 5 years from now, it might be different. But honestly, in the admissions landscape right now, I can honestly say, yeah, for a kid to bump his or her scores up significantly is still a really helpful boost to the overall admissions process for a number of reasons. And I'll share my screen again real quick. I'm going to move this back to Laura after I talk about a few more things. But bottom line on this chart here on this page is that test scores are one part of a holistic application process. And in a lot of cases, good scores are very helpful for that process. Laura will talk more about what that holistic process is a little bit in a few minutes. But suffice to say, and I think Laura would agree with this, if you don't submit scores, the rest of your application better be pretty darn solid, right? Or if you have good scores, that is one thing to add to this holistic picture that will help out the overall process. I'd like to talk about a couple things related to this environment of test optional that we're seeing right now. And let me pull this slide up. One aspect of this is merit-based financial aid. You know, most people, most families and students enter the testing and test prep process thinking, all right, if I score well enough, maybe I can get into X university. And that's one thing that tests are used for. Fewer people come into this process thinking if they score well enough they could achieve a merit-based scholarship, so merit-based financial aid. But that is critical. That is one of the critical uses of these scores, historically speaking. This chart, again, is not being used this fall for the admissions to CU Boulder this fall, but this is what has been used for the last handful of years at CU Boulder. And what you see here, this is for in-state, Colorado in-state applicants to CU Boulder. Students who have, let's say, a 3.9 GPA, it's a weighted GPA, as you see up here, and a 28 on the ACT, receive an automatic merit-based scholarship of $2,500 a year. So it's $10,000 over the course of 4 years. To take that all the way to the top, students who are at 4.0 plus weighted GPA and have a 33 on the ACT or 1480 on the SAT, it doubles. Now we're at $5,000 a year for 4 years. So this is significant money. And again, a lot of people aren't really cognizant of how tightly test scores are tied to these merit-based financial aid packages. Again, we're seeing a little bit of change on that this year with the pandemic environment, but in some capacity, merit-based aid will be one of the main uses of testing going forward. So here's the bottom line for me. Test optional is an interesting new time, and don't get me wrong, there are students for whom choosing not to submit tests is a great idea, right? And Laura, again, we'll talk more about this, but if your student has amazing essays, great leadership, really strong GPA, like if all the other aspects of a student's application are very powerfully strong, and the tests are lagging behind that, then yeah, maybe not submitting the test is a good idea because you let the other aspects of the application profile shine. If student scores are pretty good, like kind of in line with the rest of their profile, even more to the point, if the scores are more or less in line with what the school usually expects freshmen to have, submitting them is probably a good idea. And I said this a second ago, the bottom line for me is you may not choose to submit all your scores to every college that you apply to, or you might, but taking the test and doing well, to me, when you boil it down, is one tool to have in your toolkit in this college admissions process. And let's say you're going to apply to 10 schools, which is very common actually these days. Let's say you submit the scores to 4 of them and you don't submit the scores to the other 6. That's fine, but to have a good score at your disposal to do with it what you want, if it's appropriate throughout this process, I think is very, very powerful. So to me, test optional is exactly that. It gives students more options. I still think you should take the test. I still think you should try to do well. Whether you choose to submit it, how you choose to use those tests is another story. And that's something that Laura can and does help her clients decide. Should I submit X score to X college? We weigh the scholarship opportunities, you weigh the admissions opportunities, and you come up with an answer for that particular case. Couple other things I'll throw out there real quick because I know these are very common questions. One is whether students should focus on the ACT or the SAT. What I recommend and what we do with all of our students at Mindfish is that students take both an ACT and an SAT in a practice environment, and then we compare those scores to see which one is stronger and make a plan accordingly. By the way, I'm showing these slides. We'll make sure that you all have access to the PDF I'm pulling these slides from so you can look at them in more depth, because I could easily spend like 2 hours talking about these. There are official tests available on ACT.org and collegeboard.org. And then this link down here, this is what we do at my company, Mindfish. We give students practice tests of both types and then compare the results. My lighting's getting weird because said 3-year-old daughter who's hanging out at my house all the time is playing with my lighting a little bit. Honey, can you stop that, please? Thank you. Do you want to say hi to my group real quick? Okay, come here. This is my administrative assistant, Sadie. She's here.
Hi,
if you call the Mindfish offices, she'll probably answer the phone and get you guys all squared away. Reminds me of watching the election all week. One of the things I liked was all the talking heads were just like in their kitchens and stuff. It's just an interesting time right now. So long story short, on SAT, ACT, I urge students to take an official practice test, see which one is better. Really quickly, all colleges in the US accept either one, and there's no preference for SAT or ACT anywhere. If you're my age or older than me, I'm in my early 40s, there was a geographic bias back in the day. East Coast schools really love the SAT. That's no longer the case. Any college in the country will accept either test equally. When I share this PDF, there's a ton of information in here about the differences between SAT and ACT. All of these are generalizations. One of them that I really like is that students with extra time accommodations have a strong preference for the ACT in many, many cases. The rest of these, comfortable with graphs and charts, hard worker, on the SAT side, we say that problem solvers are often a good fit for the SAT. Take those with a big grain of salt. These are generalizations and there's some truth there, but for every student, if it was my daughter, I mean, she's 3, but she's already taken practice tests, as you can imagine. Just kidding. If it were me, I would take a practice test of both types and see which one's a better fit. There's also a bunch more information in here about how testing works and what test prep should look like. This is a key tidbit of info. Junior year is the time to do this. I've got some more detail about exactly when things should happen during junior year. So I'll share all this so that you all can look at the details more when you have a minute to do so. But yeah, it's a unique time right now. Test optional is sort of a brave new world for a lot of colleges. We'll see what the policies are going forward. To give you a little more detail on that, there are many schools that adopted test optional policy. Sadie, I can't talk right now, honey. Yes. Ask mom to zip your code. Thanks. There are many schools that adopted test optional policies just for this fall. There are other schools that adopted a 2-year, 3-year plan, and they're going to come up with their permanent plan thereafter. Some of you might have been hearing about what's going on in California. Even Californians don't really know, to be honest. They adopted a 4-year phase-out plan where there's kind of a tiered plan to phase out the tests after 4 years. Now in California this year, some schools are actually fully test blind, which means they don't look at the tests at all. Other schools are still looking at the tests, although they have test optional policies in place for a year. So, California is often a bellwether for this kind of stuff. So everybody's looking at what they're doing to see, what signals they send to the higher education world. They've actually talked about designing their own test in 4 or 5 years. That fact hints at an underlying truth here. I don't think testing is going away for the purposes of college admissions. And again, you might say, well, you're a test prep guy. Of course, you're going to tell us that. But in fact, all of the college counselors I talk to have that same belief. It may look different in 4 or 5 years, but there will be tests. What they're used for might continue to change, but there probably still will be tests. And for students who are motivated to be very competitive in college, doing well in those tests is going to continue to be important. So again, that's my one little corner of this college admissions world. As I said, it's a holistic process. GPA, all the other stuff is super important, and Laura can talk more about that. But in that vein, let me share one thing with you. The test is not everything, and by that I mean a couple of things. I actually have a slide on this in my little deck here. I'm just skipping around, but I like this one. First thing I mean by saying the test is not everything is that the test does not define you. It's not an intelligence test. It's not a measure of how successful you're going to be in college or after college. It is a very specific task. It's a number that factors into these college decisions. So it can open doors. That's what we're here to do in the test prep world, is to try to help open those doors. But it is not an audit of a student's capacity for success or their inherent intelligence. Nothing could be further from the truth. So students should take this test seriously and try to open those doors. But again, it does not define them in any way. And it's important to remember that there are other things that go into this process. I talk to parents of freshmen, 8th graders all the time. How can we start prepping for the SAT? And what I honestly say is do well in school, read a lot. Let's talk about the SAT in a year or two, because there's other stuff not only that is helpful for college admissions, but is helpful to the student's growth and maturation as a thinker and as an individual. The tests are one piece of this puzzle. And that's the piece I focus on. So that's why I'm talking about it so much. But I'll turn the mic over to Laura to give you a little more context about what that overall puzzle looks like and what the process looks like from her vantage at this point.
Bill, thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
I love your perspective so much. What I'd like to do is actually just any pending questions. We have our Q&A open here. So if anything that Bill said brought up any questions, or if you have even any specific questions about your own situation, we're happy to cater to those kinds of questions. Is there anything on anyone's mind before we continue? I don't see anything coming up.
Me neither at this point. If you have anything pop up, let us know. I just saw one question pop up. So can I email out the slideshow? Yes, I will plan to email out the slideshow for sure. There's a ton of info in there. Another quick one, because this is about testing, and then I'll let you take the reins, Laura. When should a student test? Someone asked. The short answer is junior year. Most students are best served by taking the test kind of in the middle of junior year. For instance, right now we're prepping a lot of students for the ACT in February. That is a great test in a lot of ways. There are some cohorts of students that might benefit from testing earlier or later, and there's more detail in this in the slideshow that I'll share with you. I'll give you an example. Star recruited athletes should often test earlier because it helps the recruitment process. So if they can have a score earlier, that's a good thing. Students who are maybe young for their grade, or maybe a little bit behind the normal arc of coursework for their grade, sometimes will benefit from taking the test later. And that's, none of these things is a judgment when I say they're behind the normal arc of classes. This is just to say every student is unique. Every student's got different needs. And so it could go slightly earlier, slightly later, depending on what those needs are. Most students, the middle of junior year is a good time to do this stuff. And just to put that in context real quick, I look at the first official test as sort of the dead center of what is usually a 5 or 6 month process, meaning students will prep for 2 or 3 months before their first test. Then they'll probably take a second test a couple of months after their first test. So when you're planning this stuff, for instance, if a student's looking at the February ACT, we're getting started with them right now. Most of those kids taking the February test will probably take another test in April. So there's our 6 month process, right? November through April, essentially. Something that I believe in is catering this to every student's individual needs. So middle of junior year is a good rule of thumb, but I'd love to chat with you and figure out what the best option for your student is. Another quick question. Someone asked, was test optional an option pre-COVID, or is this because of COVID? It was a growing movement for several years, a decade actually, leading up to COVID. A lot of people were pushing test optional for a long time before COVID. And then COVID kind of flipped it into the mainstream, at least for this year, because it makes sense. I mean, a lot of students haven't been able to test this year. We had kids who were prepping for the SAT in March, still haven't taken a test 8 months later. So that was, COVID was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back on the test optional movement. And I think it'll continue to be a prevalent movement. I think some schools will walk it back from what they're doing this year, but test optional is probably here to stay. And, ironically enough, I think the tests are also here to stay at this point.
Looks like you have another one.
Yeah, I can feel that one too. This one's about SuperScore. SuperScore is the ability to take the test a couple times and then basically cobble together a score that's made out of your individual best section scores. So the easy example is the SAT. On the SAT, there's one total score, which is out of 1,600. And that's made up of a verbal score out of 800 points and a math score that's also out of 800 points. So with a SuperScore, you could take the SAT like 3 times and take your best verbal and your best math, and you kind of combine those in what's known as a SuperScore. And that's the test, that's the score you submit to colleges. roughly 60% of colleges in the country accept SuperScore for the SAT, and it's right around 40% for the ACT. So just to make it easy, about half of the schools in the country accept SuperScore on either test. And that's one reason students are taking the test more than once, is to be able to have access to SuperScore if that's possible. Keep throwing questions at me. Happy to talk more about this, but I want to let Laura share her wisdom with us for at least a couple minutes as well.
Great. Well, I think I don't have much more to add to this. You've done such a good job of kind of filling us all in and reminding us of the kind of importance and just where the SAT, ACT fits in, and the whole idea of the where the role of testing plays in the college application process. I think it's really important for us to remember that the goal of the college application, and the college application includes of all of these different elements. The ACT, SAT is one of them. Another is the student's coursework. Another is their ability to participate in their community, in their family, in their school community, the ability to be able to show that they can share their narratives in writing, and that they have intellectual vitality. And part of the ACT, SAT, and the grit that some of these kids bring to their test prep also helps show some of that. It's not just the score alone. It's even the narrative around, I tried and I tried and I tried, and maybe I only got this, but I put the work into it. I see a lot of kids who are really determined to get those scores because they want to feel good about it. And they also have a sense that these scores are gatekeepers, and they want to be good at being test takers in college. I mean, at the very least, once they get to college, they're going to be taking tests all the time, whether we like that or not. That is how assessments occur, and how we manage expectations and learning targets is by assessing them through summative and formative assessments. So, the goal of the college application is to prove that your student will be successful in college and beyond, that students will graduate and do well in their classes, that they'll contribute positively to the college community, and that they'll have a positive impact on whatever they choose in the future, and the college will help that student on the path to achieving those goals. So if we are not going to be using the SAT or the ACT, that narrative needs to be very clear in all of the different ways that students use their voice to tell who they are on the Common Application. So that's really all that I have to share tonight, and just to remind that this process, whether it's test taking or putting together the Common Application or the application itself, is for us as parents and providers to provide the opportunity for students and parents to slow down and really tell the story of a student's life, the story of what they've done in high school and what they want to do in the future, and make this process one that is informative and transformative. So that's it from me. Does anybody have any questions just specifically for me about the college application process?
Can I ask one, Laura?
Yeah.
Just thinking about test option, I know you're going through the process with a lot of students right now. Some of them probably submitted applications like a week ago, and the next deadline is basically January. Are most of your students still submitting scores? Were there cases that students went test optional? Like what's that looked like this year?
I would say every one of my students submitted a score. I have one student that didn't, who has a unique learning profile that we decided we weren't going to do it. She also had incredible portfolio and resume and narrative, so it worked. But most students, at least in Colorado, seem pretty committed and have a strong understanding that this is something they're going to need to do, at least for now.
Sure. Yeah, and that'll the at least for now you put on the end of that, I think is great. Something kind of a summary statement I'm sharing with a lot of families is look, in 5 years, this might be a very different process. We're in the very early stages of what this development looks like. But for right now, for all the talk about how the process is changing, I basically recommend that students do what they've always done with this process. Take the test, do well, do all the other stuff that Laura can help you refine, showcasing that unique narrative and that kind of thing. If I were a parent right now, I would basically be doing everything the same as everybody's done it for the last 20 years. And again, in 5 years, it may look different, but for right now, although the landscape seems to be shifting on our side of the table, it's sort of the same process.
Well, if there's no more questions, I think we'll call it a night. I would love to. You probably all seen Hillary's name just right up there as one of our panelists. She is actually my I don't know, my right hand helper in these kind of events, and she will be following up with many of you with a questionnaire to see your satisfaction of our presentation tonight. And if there's anything else you would like to hear from us in the future, we would be happy to. Oh, look, we have some questions. Oh, okay, I see. She's saying people
Hi,
want
Heather.
to.
Thanks for that question.
Yes,
Yeah, I can definitely
everybody can
send you that
answer.
info.
Everybody can answer questions at any time.
Totally. Um, since Hillary's going to be following up with you all, I'll probably send her the PDF, and you can expect the PDF of my presentation to show up in her email as well. Yeah, my contact info is on the PDF I'm going to send out. I know you guys already have Laura's contact info, and she has yours, so feel free to follow up with her, follow up with me, anything you can think of. Something you said, Laura, just made me think of some situations that I've seen over the years, and you're saying prepping for these tests can show grit and show motivation that these students have, and I think that's true. And the other thing that played into in your remarks that I picked up on was that colleges are looking for balance, right? They're looking for kids who are really good at stuff, whether that's leadership, whether that's writing, whether that's math, really good at a lot of things, but they need like whole balanced individuals to fill out their communities on these college campuses. And so, saying I'm motivated enough that I'm going to take this test and do well and add that to my profile shows that they've got that motivation to take that part of the process seriously. On the flip side of that, your students don't need to take this test like 6 times or 8 times or like spend 2 years of their lives doing just SAT prep or something like that. I quite regularly talk to students who have like a 35 on the ACT, which is almost the perfect score, 99 plus percentile. And they're asking me, should I take it again? Should I go for a 36? And to me, the answer is no. I mean, if you want to do that, we will help you do that because we're test prep people. That's what we do. But hey, in the next 6 weeks, if you could do some really cool project or devote yourself to some inspiring passion, that will jump off the page a lot more in a college application than, hey, I did another 6 weeks of ACT prep so I could chase the perfect score. So it's a funny thing, but you can almost simplify this process down to what's good for your kid as developing, flourishing, inspiring young people is generally good for the college process. Admissions people can see that. They can see when they're dealing with a bright, mature, self-aware student, and they can see it when they're looking at somebody who's going through the motions because they think those things are going to help them in college, right? And so having that balance and that kind of perspective, I think is super powerful.
That's great. I'm so glad you said that. I think when you were talking about when to test, I really like that practice test to happen more towards the beginning of junior year, because
Yes.
then I can start gauging, at least the practice test, not the actual exam, because then I can start gauging and looking at that emerging profile that's building. I can start seeing what are the intellectual interests, what are the sports interests, what are the extracurricular, what is the test score? So as I start building those college lists, I have that range of SAT or ACT, not only because it's I match it up, but I want students to be in places where they feel like they can thrive, that may not be too intellectually competitive. If they're not intellectually competitive, or if they are, then I can help that with the college list. So it does help me be able to start putting together a list that feels like it's balanced
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and attainable.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And so what we often do at Mindfish is we'll do these practice tests in the summer before junior year. And a few of those kids will start prepping then. Most of those students will take a test in, let's say, July or August, and we'll say, all right, let's start up in, say, November and prep for the February ACT. But like Laura's saying, doing that kind of initial planning and the initial assessment a little bit earlier is quite helpful from a planning perspective, just to kind of see the whole landscape of the process. Someone just asked a question about test prep on here. What's pricing look like for a test prep class? How much time should a student spend prepping for the test? So before the first official test, I recommend 2 to 3 months of prep leading up to that first official test. To me, the gold standard of prep is if students can do like 30 minutes a day, most days of the week for those couple months leading up to the test. Don't get me wrong, I know it doesn't happen every single day or anything. These kids have a lot on their plates, but it's like practicing a musical instrument or learning a sport or anything else you want to immerse yourself in. If students can do a little bit of work consistently, regularly for a couple of months leading up to the test, that's what makes the difference. That's infinitely more powerful than, oh shoot, I've got the ACT in 2 weeks, I'm going to cram for this thing. It doesn't help that much, to be honest. So the kind of slow, steady work for a couple of months leading up to the test is great. Pricing for test prep classes can vary. I'm not here to sell stuff, but I'll tell you what we do at Mindfish. Our pricing for a full test prep course is somewhere around $1,500, give or take. There are many free resources out there for test prep. I mean, literally, if you're a motivated kid, you can do this on your own. It's hard. I don't meet that many kids who have the discipline and frankly the time to really like make themselves go through it and do it on their own. But all the resources are out there. There are good free tools for Khan Academy, or excuse me, Khan Academy for the SAT and also for the ACT. Our pricing in Mindfish is sort of like what I consider to be, sounds weird, but like normal for like a boutique test prep company. There are cheaper options out there, which are going to be more like Princeton Review or Kaplan, like bigger classes, that kind of thing. If you live in Manhattan, you could spend $1,000 an hour if you wanted to, which is completely bonkers. I was talking about balance a second ago. That's crazy. So if you want to talk to me about that, please shoot me a message. I'll talk more about it. But our programs are right around $1,500 plus or minus for a full course.
All right.
Any other questions on testing or anything?
All right, why don't we call it a night? Thank you so much. Great. Thanks, Hillary. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, everybody, for joining us tonight. We hope to see you again for another meeting down the road.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.